Well, Mr. President, as we all know, it's been an extraordinarily challenging time for our great nation, a time that has been painful for so many of our fellow Americans. But it's also been a time when people across the country have given so much to their communities, to their states, to their neighbors. And as you know, Mr. President, we are a great nation. We are a kind nation. We are a proud nation. And we are a resilient nation. This pandemic has been testing the character of our country. And I believe that we are passing the test as Americans. I believe that because I see it everywhere. I certainly see it in my state, the great state of Alaska. People passing out food, doing what they can for the elderly, tending to those in need. We're seeing this all across our nation. We see millions of our fellow citizens, people that we all have the privilege of representing here in the United States Senate, stepping up with purpose and resolve. And we see a greater appreciation for the dignity and the value of our workers who are on the front lines of helping us get through this pandemic. Now, Mr. President, I was recently home in my state. The rule in Alaska is that if you travel from the outside, when you get to Alaska, you have a very strict 14-day quarantine. So I was quarantined with my wife and our 3 daughters, hunkered down in Anchorage. But I was also able to still appreciate so much of what was happening and so many of our fellow citizens, especially frontline workers, who are helping Alaska power through this crisis. So many of them working day in and day out to ensure that our grocery stores are stocked, that the goods are transported, buildings are maintained, that our telecommunication systems are running, that our airplanes are flying, that our hospitals are open, our healthcare workers can give care, and that our teachers, our extraordinary teachers, are finding creative ways to teach our kids. The list goes on and on. It's happening in every state across the nation. So last week, I decided to give an impromptu Alaskan of the Week speech in my backyard. Wasn't here on the Senate floor the way we usually do it, the way we're doing it today. And I was highlighting these workers, many of them part of the Teamsters Local 959, led by third-generation Teamster Gary Dixon. So I want to say thank you to them again. You know, we talk a lot about people who are telecommuting. That's great. It's important to get us through this pandemic. But as we all know, there's a lot of people who can't do that. Really, our national heroes right now, workers, essential workers who are on the front lines, keeping our economies and our supply lines open, moving, robust. But now that I'm back in D.C. and the Senate is open again, finally open again, and the business of the Senate is continuing, so does our Alaskan of the Week series from the floor of the U.S. Senate. One of my favorite times of the week, where I get to focus on a special Alaskan. I think the presiding officer likes it a lot too. Or a group of Alaskans that's made Alaska such a great, unique place. So I had intended, as I mentioned, on my Alaskan of the Week speech here, coming back to focus on more of these frontline workers who are doing so much in our state, so much in our country, to get us through this pandemic. However, Mr. President, some really interesting, I think, exciting news on Monday in our state broke. This big news born of a tragic situation, and for that reason, I thought we would have a different focus of our Alaskan of the Week. So the Alaskan of the Week this week is an intrepid Alaska reporter, Kyle Hopkins, who led coverage in our local paper, the Anchorage Daily News, that earned him the 2020 Pulitzer Prize for Public Service. Probably the most prestigious award in all American journalism, the prize of prizes. Kyle Hopkins, Alaska reporter, won that on Monday. He won it for a 17-story series called Lawless, about the public safety crisis in rural Alaska and the horrendous issue of sexual assault and domestic violence in our state. As we all know, we are confronting a pandemic in our country. I live in a great state, but we have a lot of challenges, social challenges, just like a lot of states. We're confronting this pandemic right now nationally. My state's been confronting an epidemic of domestic violence, sexual abuse that has been going on for years, decades, generations. Kyle's series combined dogged reporting, meticulous fact-checking, with the utmost sensitivity that a subject like this requires. Not an easy task at all. It was, according to the Pulitzer Committee, riveting public service reporting. But, Mr. President, it was so much more than that. And I will tell you, it was very, very important to the state of Alaska. So let me tell you a little bit about our Alaskan of the Week, Kyle Hopkins, and what made him very qualified to write this series and why it's had such an impact, and I believe beginning, maybe I should say I hope, beginning to change, to bring changes to our public safety system, and most importantly, the unfortunate culture that we have in our state that spawns this kind of abuse and violence. Kyle was born in beautiful Sitka, Alaska. That's in southeast Alaska. His father was a teacher and came from California to teach the children of logging camp workers at a time when the southeast part of our state had a very vital timber industry. The family moved back to California after a few years, but then back to Alaska again, and then away, and then back again. Sitka, Cake, Skagway, 2 small towns, 1 village, all in Alaska's beautifully gorgeous southeast. For Kyle, the towns provided the backdrop of a magical childhood. Spruce trees that seemed to rise to the clouds, aquatic universes and tidal basins, fish to catch, towering totem poles. In high school, it was all about basketball for him, as it is for so many Alaskan high schoolers and kids. Traveling for tournaments in Alaska is a unique experience, requiring trips on small bush planes. For Kyle, he remembered seeing the planes, the ferries. Quote, "I remember thinking I was lucky to see and do these things." Even as a young man, he knew that. He went to the University of Alaska Fairbanks for college, searching for a subject that allowed him to read a lot, and he had an advisor that recommended a journalism class. Well, the rest you could say is history. During college, he had a host of internships across the state in journalism covering business, politics, sports, crime, all the usual beats. In some of our best journalism and media establishments, the Fairbanks Daily News Miner, before moving to Anchorage to work for the Anchorage Press, a weekly paper, then to KTUU, Channel 2, our big TV station in Alaska, and then where he is now, the Anchorage Daily News. Throughout all of his reporting, a few things constantly struck him. One, we're a very big state. But how few people, even in Alaska, had ever been to a village in our state. They didn't know the challenges and the beauty of what we call rural Alaska, the soul of Alaska. More than 200 villages that dot our state, most which are not connected by any roads or infrastructure. And he was always struck and increasingly disturbed by the challenge that I mentioned at the outset of my remarks. These very high rates of sexual violence that we have in Alaska. Depending on how you measure it, at least 3 times the national average. 3 times the national average. Just like so many of us in Alaska, he assumed that someday the adults, the people in charge, would do something about it. Until he realized, at a certain point in his life, that he was an adult. And he had 2 children, 2 girls with his wife, Rebecca Palsha, another intrepid reporter in Alaska. And he wanted to make Alaska a better place, not only for his girls, but for all other children across our state, a state that he knows and loves. So the time was right to tackle this issue. And the time was right for another reason. Throughout the state, there was a more open discussion about this dark issue, this black mark on Alaska, the issue of sexual assault. Brave women had started coming forward to tell their stories. A statewide initiative that I was part of called Choose Respect was launched over a decade ago, trying to address cultural changes. And then the Me Too movement came, and more people were beginning to share their stories of trauma and abuse and to have the courage to do it, because it takes courage. Kyle not only captured many of those voices, he also began to dig into the larger issues of generational trauma, and an issue that is so important in our state, the lack of law enforcement in many of these places, in so many small villages across Alaska. He did it all the while by capturing the complexities of a multi-tiered public safety system in Alaska. Working with ProPublica, he traveled throughout the state, dug through reams of documents, talked to dozens and dozens of survivors, perpetrators, police officers, lawyers, you name it. Let me try to capture the breadth and depth and heartache of his 17-part series, told by just a few headlines. These are some of the headlines of the stories in the Anchorage Daily News. 1, discussing Alaska's history of sexual violence is one step towards seeking solutions. Another headline, lawless. 1 in 3 Alaska villages have no police, local police. Another headline, dozens of convicted criminals have been hired as cops in rural Alaska. Sometimes they're the only applicants. Another headline, she leapt from a van on the Kenai Peninsula to escape her rapist. Then she waited 18 years for the arrest to happen. You get the picture, Mr. President. Let me summarize the opening to one of the stories. A first-person piece, headline, quote, why we're investigating sexual violence in Alaska. And it tells Alaskans why this series is delving into this very, very difficult topic. It's a story, a horrible story, of a very young girl in one of our villages, vanished from the playground, found later, sexually abused, murdered, and it rips your heart out. These are the kind of stories that I've certainly heard about and tried to address in my time in public service in Alaska. These are the stories that haunt us as Alaskans. They've haunted countless Alaskans. Of course, survivors, victims, their families, leaders, good citizens, good people. They are difficult and shocking stories to tell, but they need to be told. They must be told. And that's what Kyle Hopkins did. And that's why he earned the Pulitzer Prize. And these are the kind of stories that Attorney General Barr confronted when he came to Alaska last May. His first trip to any state in the country after he was confirmed as our new Attorney General. Before his confirmation hearing, Senator Murkowski and I had both invited him to come to Alaska. We talked to him in detail about these challenges. And then we did something that I think mattered. And again, it gives a sense of why this series was so important. We started sending the Attorney General some of Kyle Hopkins' stories in this 17-part series, the ones that he had written at this time. So the Attorney General knew, before he even got there, some of the challenges because of this reporting. So he came to our state. Attorney General Barr actually came to our state for almost 5 days, a long visit, to hear from survivors, law enforcement, lawyers, meeting dozens of Alaskans throughout the state who have worked on these issues, some without a voice, without help from the federal government, many tribal members. It was a really important trip. He was given a beautiful kuspuk as a gift, and when he left, he took a piece of Alaska with him in his heart. I'm convinced of that. Matter of fact, I talked to him about Alaska yesterday on the phone and this very series. He still wears the kuspuk, by the way. He says it makes him look trim. Shortly after returning to D.C., he began to focus with the Department of Justice on some of these big issues, declaring a public safety emergency in rural Alaska and starting to free up significant resources to improve public safety in our state's rural communities. So the funding helps, and it's already being put to good use. But, Mr. President, this is a story not just about money. As a matter of fact, that's not even the important issue. The important issue is culture. We desperately need a cultural change on these issues in Alaska that have been going on for way too long. And that's another reason why Kyle's work is so important. Because you can't change the culture if you don't know how broken it is. Will it work? Does he think things will change? I wouldn't presume to know, he said when my team caught up with him on Tuesday, a day after the Pulitzer Prize was announced. Already hard at work on another story, by the way. I hope things change, he said. That's one of the goals of a series like this. But if nothing changes, at least people will know about the injustice in our system. And if it's going to continue, if we're going to allow this to continue, it should be with our knowledge. That's his quote. This is my place, Kyle added, talking about Alaska. It's an awesome place, and I don't want to live any other place. But things are wrong. And it shouldn't be for the next generation, for my girls or other girls. If there's something we should do about it and can do about it, we should do it. That's his quote. And of course, Mr. President, he's right. We should do it. And many of us in Alaska, really thousands of us in Alaska, are committed to this cause and have been committed to this cause for a long time. And I believe Kyle's work is going to help a lot in that regard. So I want to thank the Anchorage Daily News for supporting this series, to all the staff who worked on the series, to the owners, the Binkleys. Thanks to the Pulitzer Committee for recognizing the importance of this series. And thank you, Kyle, for your hard work and determination. Congratulations again on winning the Pulitzer Prize, and probably even more prestigious than winning the Pulitzer Prize for the United States. Congratulations on being our Alaskan of the Week. I yield the floor.